Well, I will say right up front that I had a lot of fun with this. In fact, it was so much fun, you might even say it was a scream. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about a brand new theatrical release, Scream, or Scream 2022. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time, and let's talk about Scream. This takes place 25 years after the original series of murders in Woodsboro, where a new Ghostface emerges, and Sidney Prescott, played again by Neve Campbell, must return to uncover the truth. So I'm going to do something I normally don't do with my reviews of newer films, but I am going to dive into spoilers for this one, because with Scream, it's hard to talk about these movies without getting into spoilers, and especially since I just reviewed the other 4 films, I talked about those with spoilers as well. So I'm going to timestamp this video, so if you haven't seen this yet, once I'm done talking about the spoiler-free stuff, you can skip ahead to my closing thoughts and rating, and then when you see the movie, you can come back to the rest of this video. But that being said, let's jump right into it. Due to the passing of Wes Craven in 2015, this is the first film in the franchise not directed by him. Instead, this is directed by Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillette, who also collectively go by the name Radio Silence, and were also behind the 2019 horror comedy Ready or Not, which I liked and I felt made them a perfect fit for this. And the film is co-written by Guy Busick, who also wrote Ready or Not, along with James Vanderbilt, while Kevin Williamson, who wrote all the other movies besides 3, only served as an executive producer. And this once again taps into something that Scream 4 had attempted to do, but this time it fully commits to this even more. While we do once again see the legacy characters, Sidney, Gale, and Dewey, the latter 2 once again being played by Courtney and David Arquette, the main focus this time is on a new set of characters. But whereas Scream 4 featured all 3 of the legacy characters in pretty active roles for much of the film, with their roles maybe just a touch less prominent than the newer characters, here they are in full-fledged supporting roles. They still help out, they still have their own respective arcs, but this time they really aren't at the forefront of the story. Nor do they all jump in to help at the same time. Dewey almost immediately steps in once he's asked for help, pretty much the same as he had in the last few movies, but this time both Gale and Sidney don't get on board till a little later on, which for Sidney is something similar to Scream 3, but is definitely a change of pace for Gale, who usually is also just as prominent as Dewey right from the start. But with the 2 of them now being divorced, reflecting the real-life divorce of David Arquette and Courtney Cox, Gale starts off completely separated from everything else for the first part of the film as well. Instead, our new lead is Sam, played by Melissa Barrera, who used to live in Woodsboro and returns along with her boyfriend Richie, played by Jack Quaid, after her sister Tara, played by Jenna Ortega, is attacked by Ghostface in the opening scene. And to talk about that opening scene real quick, as that's become a series tradition, it's once again something really solid. It channels a lot of the same energy as the Drew Barrymore scene in the first Scream, simply taking place in a house with one person and a conversation about horror movies over the phone driving the scene forward before Ghostface attacks. It goes back to a formula we've seen before, but it's worth noting for a couple of things. Like Scream 4, which was out 11 years after Scream 3, which is still wild to think about as it's been 11 years since this movie, this also addressed Ghostface once again keeping up with all the technological updates in the 11 years since 4. Like we see in the trailer, Tara is able to control the locks to the house from an app on her phone, and Ghostface is also able to manipulate that so he can still find a way in. This also kicks off one of the themes that becomes the big topic of conversation throughout the movie, as horror has especially come a long way, even from the days of Scream 4. Tara mentions how she's a big fan of elevated horror, like The Babadook and It Follows, and not that movies in this vein are unique to the 21st century, as you can argue some classic horror movies fall under that banner, but especially in the last decade, they've certainly become much more of the norm. And one of the big topics of conversation involves the generational clashing, so to speak. When the first Scream was out, most of the big horror movies were slasher movies, especially sequels to long-running franchises like A Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, and Halloween. And that's typically what comes to mind first and foremost for a lot of people when it comes to horror movies. Not necessarily these art house style movies that rely a lot on themes and rich character development. And it seems to these newer characters that a lot of Ghostface's motivations are about going back to basics, getting back to the root of the original movie and away from the traits that fall under elevated horror. Which then goes hand in hand with the other big point of satire in this film, which is what's now called the requel, or the reboot/sequel. Similar to movies like Star Wars The Force Awakens or Halloween 2018, 2018, this is starting to become a trend with franchises where they go back to the original. Some, like Halloween, will completely disregard all the other sequels that came before it, while others, like this movie, won't even add a number anymore to their titles. Like, you even see that with the Marvel movies now too. They dropped calling each of their movies 2, 3, 4, and so on after Iron Man 3. Not that I would necessarily call those requels, but still. So, the rules of this movie channel the requel, and we once again get a movie that knows exactly what it is, fully embraces it, and is chock full of meta commentary. Maybe just a tad less than the other movies, but there are plenty of shots taken at both horror movies from the past decade, as well as general trends in the movie industry in the last decade. And the one thing it especially brings up is toxic fandoms. This is something that tends to be a very polarizing issue, but it's one that I think needed to be addressed. Now, I'm going to make this clear. On one hand, I'm all for movies or shows that play into fan service and give fans of long-running franchises what they want, as long as it's done right. Movies like Avengers Endgame and Spider-Man No Way Home are two great examples of that. I also thought Ghostbusters Afterlife was another very good example of that, though I know some people are a little more divided on that one. But either way, on the other hand, when it comes to certain major franchises with a built-in, hardcore dedicated fanbase, you'll have those extremely vocal groups within the fanbase who make the thing they like essentially their entire personality, and they feel so strongly about the franchise or franchises they enjoy that they take it as this personal slight if a new entry doesn't line up exactly with what they want, or if someone has a differing opinion than theirs and they become extremely condescending about it. This is something you generally don't see brought up in film or TV all that often, but this does a great job at tackling it. It winds up going hand in hand with the rules of the requel especially, and it becomes one of the big points of satire throughout this film. I won't get into too much further detail regarding it for now, but I think it's something that should be explored a bit more in general, and this did a great job of dealing with that. Now, one other thing I wanted to address is this movie's tone. Every Scream movie is known for bordering on horror comedy territory, and some will even label them as such. But this one, despite being helmed by the creative team behind another well-received horror comedy, is probably the most serious of all the Scream movies. It's not completely somber or anything, and there is still a lot of that trademark humor in there, but there are considerably more moments here that take themselves seriously than some of the other movies. Like, there are times where something happens and we might take a beat to just be in that moment with these characters and get a grasp on how they're dealing with it emotionally. It's not the prevailing tone for the entire movie. I'd still say there is a sense of fun, but again, it's something that's a bit of a break from the other films. But at least with that, we do get some excellent performances. As far as the legacy characters, Neve Campbell is as always fantastic. She never ceases to be one of the most endearing parts of the series. Similar to the fourth movie, she has a lot more of this over it attitude, where she gives even less of a crap as far as what Ghostface wants and just wants to make sure he's in the ground. Probably my favorite line of dialogue in the entire movie is at one point she's on the phone with him and after a few seconds she just goes, "I'm bored," and hangs up. I thought that was brilliant. Now, Courtney Cox is good, and like the fourth movie, she's definitely become a lot more likable as these movies have gone on. That being said, she also probably gets the least to do of the main three this time around. She's still fine, and it's not like she's off to the side for the entire movie, but it's definitely less compared to the other two, and less compared to her role in any of the other films. However, this is probably the best David Arquette has been as Dewey. Like I've said, since Scream 3, he's kind of been the one primarily leading the charge against Ghostface right from the get-go each time he comes back, and that doesn't change here. But this time, it's channeled into a much more meaningful arc. He's no longer with Gail, he goes from being the sheriff to a recluse, he's an alcoholic, and by doing this, it gives him more purpose than it ever did before, especially since, like you hear in the trailer, he says something about this feeling different, and I thought the way his arc goes, it was excellent. But from the newcomers, Melissa Barrera and Jenna Ortega are easily the two big standouts. They have the richest characterization, we explore not only their respective backstories, but the importance of their relationship to each other, and they both do a fantastic job. Their chemistry was excellent, and because of how much they're given to do, we're able to care about them just as much as the legacy characters who we continuously keep coming back to these films to see. And there's a friend group, of course, as there are in most of these movies, most of whom were fine. I wouldn't say every single one of them gets a ton to do, mainly because this is one of the bigger friend groups in these films, and because this movie has to keep things moving with this whodunit story, while also setting up what the legacy characters have been up to, while also getting into some of the history among these other characters, they can't stop things to do a big deep dive on on every single person. But they were all pretty charismatic. There was solid chemistry among everyone, and a few of them getting some good quips, though some have roles that basically amount to just being by the side of either Sam or Tara and not much else before they encounter Ghostface, but they were fine. I'd say of all of them, Jasmine Savoy Brown as Mindy was my personal favorite. She's the big, fast-talking movie fanatic of the group who explains a lot of the rules and offers a good chunk of that meta commentary, especially acknowledging they're all in a movie. I found her to be a big scene stealer each time we got to see her, and she made the biggest impression out of everyone who wasn't either Tara, Sam, or the returning characters. And that's where I'll leave things as far as the spoiler-free section goes. Now, I wanted to address the spoiler section of this movie. So now, if you haven't seen Scream 2022 yet, and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Skip to my closing thoughts, and then come back to this once you've seen the movie. But anyway, here we go. So of course, like I said earlier, it's hard to completely discuss what makes a Scream movie good or not without discussing the third act and the reveal of the killers. And similar to all but the third film, we once again have two. And I was fine with these. These weren't my favorite of the reveals, but they're both far from the worst. The first reveal was one of the friends named Amber, played by Mikey Madison. And one thing I have to address, which I initially was not going to address as I was watching this, was that my suspicion as far as at least who one of the two were was Amber. And I initially felt my reasoning was a little silly, as it was mainly because Mikey Madison's last film credit was just playing one of the Manson family members in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in 2019. She was one of the few in the supporting cast I recognized going in. I knew she could play that part well, and they make it clear in both the advertising as well as the movie itself that it's always someone you know, and it's someone within the friend group, so in a way it fit. A little silly, right? Well, consider me shocked that not only was she one of the killers, but they also take her out in literally almost the exact same way as her Once Upon a Time in Hollywood character. Like, almost beat by beat, where she's flailing around with a knife and lit on fire. I truthfully don't know if this was intentional. It's already something that's been pointed out numerous times by anyone else who discusses spoilers, so obviously I'm not the only one saying this, but the way it's done is way too similar. I'd love to know if it truly was coincidental or if it was some sort of homage. So far, it's not listed as being intentional. But I will say, Mikey Madison, despite this now being the second time where she's a killer who meets the exact same fate, does a great job, as she really plays into the over-the-top feel that's needed when we get these big reveals. I enjoyed her performance. There was especially a great scene where she attempts to fake out Sidney and Gail towards the end and pretend she's a victim and they don't even buy it for a second, and I thought that was fun. I just hope for her next big movie she gets to do more, because it's clear she can be a lot of fun, especially in these big genre movies. But either way, I was fine with this reveal overall, even if I didn't love it. As for the second person, initially my thoughts were on another one in the friend group, Liv, played by Sonia Ben-Amar, who's also the girlfriend of Mindy's brother Chad, played by Mason Gooding. When she hung back early on as the others went to visit Tara in the hospital, that made me think her. But then there were numerous shots taken at her by the rest of the friends, commenting on whether or not she could specifically be the killer. And it became clear that she was being set up as a red herring, and it definitely was not going to be her. My backup choice was something that I know was a long-running fan theory about Matthew Lillard's Stu returning. Now, I usually don't buy into fan theories like that, but for all the talk in this movie about going back to the original, on top of the fact that Stu was initially meant to be brought back for Scream 3, there was a thought starting to creep up in the back of my head where I was like, no way. They're really doing this? Like, I started mentally preparing myself for that one, and I was telling myself all this time leading up to this movie that there was no way they would do it. And obviously they didn't, but they had me going for a second. The other one was Jack Quaid's Richie, and I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't quite as big of a fan of this reveal. Not that Jack Quaid does a bad job, because he was great too, and I get that they were dropping hints saying things like don't trust the love interest, especially because it's going back to the original, but I don't know, it was fine. I think my main issue is that while this is technically the first movie since the original where it is the love interest, keep in mind, a big storyline in 2 was whether or not Derek was one of the killers. On top of the love interest Trevor in the 4th was initially going to be framed as one of the killers, even though he was a mostly throwaway character. I get that it's in the rules not to trust the love interest, like Dewey brings it up early on, but I think they could have gone with something a little more original. But at the very least, I do like there were some lines thrown in there towards the end acknowledging that, as well as the nature of the movie in general. Richie says upon his reveal that it's a bummer it's him, and right before he's revealed, Sidney, while on the phone with supposedly him, as he says he's not Amber, call him the most derivative killer of them all, though mainly referencing the fact that the final act took place in Stu's house. But still, I would say this is a twofold jab. But even though these weren't my favorite of the reveals, I still thought this stuck the landing quite well, as it once again goes back to that toxic fandom topic I brought up earlier. Both Richie and Amber reveal the reasoning for this was due to Stab 8, the ongoing movie within a movie series, being a letdown and not what the fans wanted, and this was their way of doing what they feel Stab 8 should have. And Richie in particular constantly complains throughout the ending about being mocked for liking something so much, and keeps going on about this being his ending. And the movie within a movie controversy behind Stab 8 is something that's initially brought up by Mindy early on when explaining the rules, and by the way, if you didn't pick up on it, it's a very clear reference to Rian Johnson directing The Last Jedi, and the way fans absolutely lost their minds over that movie. Despite that receiving some of the most positive reviews in all of Star Wars, hardcore fans absolutely lost it over that. So if you remember that clearly, and think the way people reacted to it was a little overboard, to say the least, this hits even harder for you. And that's far from the first or last time something like that's happened, but it's definitely the most notable. Now, I'm not going to go into a debate right now about my thoughts on Star Wars 8 or Stab 8 or Game of Thrones Season 8 or anything else in that vein. But what I will say is, I thought this motivation worked perfectly. Toxic fandoms are a very relevant issue today, and it's something that resonated with me, as it's something I see a lot when it comes to discussions regarding a lot of major franchises. It's nothing I talk about regularly myself, but I appreciate that this movie addressed it and satirized it by showing the most extreme example of it going out of control, and pointing out and making fun of something that is a pretty big issue. And to be clear, this is not me saying that I think fans should not be given what they want. Like I said, I'm all for fan service. I think it's nice to see fans be rewarded for their dedication to certain franchises. And there's also nothing wrong with critiquing a movie or a show if one feels the story isn't told well, because I'd be a hypocrite if I said I had an issue with people criticizing a movie. But there's also a fine line, and the absolute vile way people can get if something doesn't meet their exact requirements, and the way they'll nastily talk down to others over it, is far from the healthy, supportive nature that should come with fandom. So this was all done well. Now, a few other quick things I wanted to bring up that I wanted to avoid in the spoiler-free section. Obviously, we also see the return of Billy Loomis, played by a de-aged Skeet Ulrich, looking like he did in his final scene in the original, and he's present as a vision haunting Sam, who's revealed to be his secret, illegitimate daughter. Now, on one hand, it was cool to see Skeet Ulrich reappear as the character. Truthfully, I did not see that one coming, and I figured if he was going to reappear as a vision at any point in this series, he'd be terrorizing Sidney. So that was an interesting twist. But this was one of the areas I was a little more mixed on. Like, there are times we see his vision encouraging her to fight back against the killers. And I mean, this was fine. It was a little cheesy, to be honest, because Billy was clearly a dick through all the original movie. So this is really him being the way Sam wished he was, and I don't know. It was a clear fan service moment, so that's fine. I've seen worse moments that try doing this, but the way it's presented, I think it could have been done a little better. But this was also a great swan song for David Arquette in this franchise, who has come close to death in every other entry besides 3. But this time, he gets killed for real here, attempting to finish off Ghostface halfway through the movie, only to meet his end. Even though it's something people suspected going in, it is still sad to see, considering he's been such a staple in this franchise for so long, and his character has gotten better with each successive movie. So, if they are to make a Scream 6, unless he appears as a vision himself, it'll be sad to see that he's no longer a part of these, as like I said earlier, he was great here. Interestingly enough though, similar to the first movie, we do get 2 fake out deaths here, like how we initially thought Dewey and Randy both died in the first movie, as here it's revealed both Mindy and Chad survived their attacks, which was nice to see. So again, if Scream 6 gets off the ground, it'll be cool to see them both potentially return again, along with the remaining legacy characters and new characters, along with, hopefully, Hayden Panettiere's Kirby from Scream 4, who, in a blink and you miss it moment here, is revealed to have survived Scream 4 after it being left ambiguous via a quick shot of a YouTube video. I thought that was pretty cool, as she was another great character in this franchise as a whole, and it would be great to see her return down the line. Scream 2022 is another great entry in this franchise. While it's a bit more serious than your average Scream movie, it's still filled with a lot of meta commentary, ranging from topics like toxic fandom, to requels, to the state of horror movies in general. It's another thrilling entry that also has some meaningful character arcs, with plenty of standout performances, in particular from David Arquette, Melissa Barrera, Jenna Ortega, and as always, Neve Campbell. It'll be fun to see where they take this franchise next if they were to continue with it, but if this is truly the end, they'll have gone out on a really solid note. Scream 2022 gets an 8 out of 10. So I just also finished up a review series of the first 4 Scream movies, and I'll leave a link to the playlist in the description in case you missed any of them. But now that I've reviewed all 5 Scream movies, stay tuned, as up next I'll be ranking every Scream movie from worst to best. But in the meantime, let me know, did you see Scream 2022, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did this live up to the original movies? Do you want to see more of these get made? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.